There are stories that history records, then quietly folds away into a drawer. Not because they are unimportant, but because they raise too many questions that no one wishes to answer. In 1962, 12 scientists departed from the port of Murmansk aboard a Soviet icebreaker. They were among the finest minds in their respective fields: physicists, geologists, meteorologists, specialists in Earth's magnetic field. Their mission, according to official documents, was to collect climate data in the Arctic region over a period of 6 weeks. The expedition was meticulously planned. Equipment was complete. The budget had been approved at the highest levels. 6 weeks later, the ship returned. 12 scientists were not on board. And for more than 60 years since that day, the Soviet government, and later the Russian government, has never offered a full explanation for what happened on the ice north of the 80th parallel. Something does not add up in this story. To understand why this story matters, we need to return to the world of 1962, a year in which humanity stood at the edge of nuclear catastrophe. October 1962 was the month of the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union faced each other in the most dangerous standoff of the Cold War. But few people know that, running parallel to that crisis in a place far more remote, a scientific expedition was underway on direct orders from the Soviet Academy of Sciences, an institution that was never entirely separate from Moscow's military and intelligence apparatus. By 1962, the space race was at its peak. But alongside it, another quieter race was being run beneath the ocean and across the Arctic ice. The race to understand and control Earth's magnetic field. The Arctic was not simply a place of ice and polar bears. It was the region where the planet's magnetic forces converged, where radio signals could be bent or amplified in unpredictable ways, where the guidance systems of ballistic missiles might behave in ways that no engineer had calculated for. Both superpowers wanted to understand that territory, and both were willing to send their finest people there. The 12 scientists were not anonymous figures. They were people with records, with families, with research papers published in respected Soviet academic journals. Leading the expedition was Dr. Alexei Voronov, 44 years old, the foremost specialist in polar magnetic fields at Leningrad University. According to colleagues who survived him, Voronov had spent more than a decade studying magnetic anomalies in polar regions, areas where compasses turned without following their usual rules, where electronic instruments behaved erratically for no apparent reason. Beside him was Natalia Sorokina, 38 years old, one of the few women certified for Arctic field research at that time. She was a meteorologist, specializing in abnormal weather phenomena at high latitudes. In a letter written to her younger sister before departure, a letter now preserved in a private family archive in St. Petersburg, she wrote, "This time will be different. We are going somewhere that no one has yet fully documented. I feel both excitement and an unease that I cannot put into words." No one understood what that letter meant until decades later. The remaining 10 came from research institutes across the Soviet Union: Moscow, Leningrad, Novosibirsk. Their ages ranged from 31 to 52. All had field experience. All had passed physical and psychological evaluations before boarding. All had been cleared at a high level of security classification. According to the official report of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, a document unusually brief, running to only 3 pages, the expedition left the ship on September 14, 1962, to conduct field surveys on the ice. They planned to camp for 5 days at a predetermined location, gather their data, and return to the vessel. On September 19th, Captain Pyotr Kasimov wrote in the ship's log, "No signal from the science team. Poor weather. Waiting." September 20th, still no signal. Sent 3 sailors to the rendezvous point. Found no one. September 21st, search expanded. No trace. Decided to hold position for another 48 hours per protocol. On September 24th, the ship began its return journey. No further entries in the log made any reference to the 12 scientists. The report concluded that this had been an accident under conditions of extreme weather. No official investigation was announced. No hearings were held. No independent commission was formed. The families of those lost were notified within a few weeks, but according to many of them in later accounts, they were asked not to discuss the matter with people outside. This is where the story begins to grow more complicated than the official record would have us believe. The first issue is the weather. Captain Kasimov's log cited poor weather as a factor hampering the search. But independent meteorological data from the Norwegian monitoring station at Longyearbyen, approximately 400 kilometers away, recorded that between September 19th and 24th, 1962, conditions in the Norwegian Arctic were unusually stable for the season. No significant storm was documented within a radius wide enough to affect the area where the Soviet vessel was operating. The second issue concerns communications equipment. The expedition carried 3 independent radio transmitters, standard regulation for any expedition of that kind at that time. The probability of all 3 failing simultaneously was extraordinarily low. In a 1987 interview with the Soviet science publication Nauka I Zizn, a radio engineer who had once worked on Arctic expedition programs, a man who asked not to be named, said, "The equipment they were carrying was designed to function in the worst possible conditions. If there was no signal, that does not mean the equipment failed. Could mean something else entirely." He did not elaborate. That interview was never republished. The third inconsistency, and perhaps the most striking, involves what the 3 sailors sent to search actually reported upon returning to the ship. According to an internal memorandum, a document never included in the official report, but copied and preserved by a former Academy employee until his death in 2004. When he left it to his daughter, the 3 sailors described finding the science team's camp. The tents were still standing. The equipment was still there. The food supplies were still there. The research journals were still there, open to the last entry dated September 18th. But there were no footprints leading away from the camp. No signs of struggle. No indication whatsoever that 12 human beings had departed in any direction. In 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed and portions of the State Archive were opened, several researchers attempted to locate records pertaining to the 1962 expedition. What they found and what they failed to find pointed in an unsettling direction. Historian of science Dmitry Fedotov, who spent many years researching Cold War scientific programs, noted in his 1998 book that the majority of documents related to the expedition had been placed in a category marked restricted access, a classification that was not equivalent to military secrecy but was not fully open to the public either. The materials he was able to access appeared, in his words, to have been edited, not in the sense of being redacted, but in the sense of being incomplete. There are gaps where information should exist. More revealing was what Fedotov found outside the official record. In the archive of Leningrad University, he discovered a collection of correspondence between Dr. Voronov and a colleague at the Institute of Geophysics, written in the months before the expedition. In those letters, Voronov described undocumented magnetic anomalies at the coordinates we will survey, a region that behaved, in his words, in ways inconsistent with any current theoretical model. In the last letter written before he boarded the ship, he added, "I am not certain what we will find, but I am certain that whatever we find, it will raise questions about some things we believed we already understood." This is what many researchers have pointed to in the decades since, though none of them have drawn definitive conclusions. The 1962 expedition was not an isolated case. Between 1957 and 1971, at least 4 scientific expeditions to the Arctic, 2 Soviet, 1 American, 1 Canadian, experienced incidents that were never fully explained. Not all of them resulted in the loss of lives, but all of them shared one feature. The members who returned described experiences that official investigators later classified as psychological responses to extreme environmental conditions. That is a very convenient phrase. It explains everything while explaining nothing. In 1969, a Norwegian meteorologist named Lars Eriksson published a paper in the Arctic Research Journal in which he described a phenomenon he called geomagnetic silent zones, small areas within polar regions where Earth's magnetic field exhibited unpredictable fluctuations, not following its normal cycles but behaving according to patterns that appeared random. Within these zones, he wrote, electronic instruments operate unreliably, and there are reports, though I cannot verify them scientifically, of severe disorientation in both humans and animals. That paper attracted little attention. Eriksson died in 1973. His research was never systematically continued, but the coordinates he identified as one of the known geomagnetic silent zones, not precise information, only an estimate derived from scattered reports, fell within the general region where the 1962 expedition had been operating. In 2006, a Russian journalist named Irina Morozova conducted a series of interviews with surviving relatives of the expedition's members. She compiled these accounts in an article published in the magazine Oganek, one of Russia's oldest and most respected publications. One detail appeared repeatedly across many of the interviews. Several families described how, in the weeks after receiving the news, they had been visited privately by unidentified officials. These men wore no uniforms and presented no identification. They simply arrived, sat down, spoke quietly, and left. The content of those conversations, according to the families, always contained a single consistent thread, an emphasis that the journey was undertaken for the country and that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. The son of meteorologist Natalia Sorokina, who had been 6 years old at the time and was in his 50s when interviewed, recalled that the man who visited his family had left behind a small envelope. Inside was a black and white photograph. It showed the camp on the ice. The tents stood upright. The equipment was arranged neatly. The sky was clear. There was no one in the photograph. I asked my mother what it meant, he said. She looked at it for a long time. Then she put it away and never mentioned it again. More than 60 years have passed. The Soviet Union no longer exists. Many archives have been opened. Historians have accessed millions of pages of Cold War documentation. But regarding the 1962 expedition, regarding 12 people who walked off a ship on the morning of September 14th and never returned, no new answers have emerged. That itself is worth sitting with. In an age of information, the absence of information sometimes speaks more loudly than its presence. Why would an ordinary weather accident require visits from unidentified officials? Why were the families of those lost asked to remain silent if there was nothing to conceal? Why did 3 sailors find a camp in perfect condition, food, equipment, journals, and have that discovery left entirely out of the official report? And why, most strikingly of all, were there no footprints leading away from that camp in any direction?
People die in Arctic blizzards.
People become disoriented in whiteout conditions. People fall through hidden crevasses in the ice. All of these things are devastating. All of them can be explained. But 12 people simultaneously, leaving no trace at all? Not a hat blown away by the wind. Not a glove dropped on the ice. Not a scuff mark. Not a final scrawled note. That is not how people disappear. Not according to any physical principle we understand. There are things that any honest investigator must acknowledge lie beyond their reach. We do not know what happened on the ice on September 18th or 1962, somewhere north of the 80th parallel. We do not know whether the magnetic anomalies Dr. Voronov described in his letters had any connection to his disappearance. We do not know what was written on the final pages of the research journal that the 3 sailors found, because that journal, according to the internal memorandum mentioned earlier, was confiscated for further analysis and was never returned, never made public, and never referenced again. We do not know where the black and white photograph left in the Sorokina family's envelope is today. And we do not know who the man was who brought it to their door. What we do know is this: 12 well-trained, experienced, well-equipped scientists walked into the ice and did not come back. And the story we have been given about their disappearance contains gaps large enough to call the entire structure of it into question. The Arctic is still there. The ice is receding, year by year, exposing terrain that centuries of glaciers had buried. Sometimes things are found in the melting ice, things from other times, from expeditions that history forgot. Perhaps one day, someone will find something at the coordinates where the 1962 expedition traveled. Perhaps not. Perhaps there is no mystery here at all. Perhaps this is simply a Cold War tragedy. 12 people lost to the ambitions of science and geopolitics, then buried in silence because the story was inconvenient for those in power. That alone would be devastating enough. That alone might explain the silence. Or perhaps, in those final days on the ice, 12 scientists stood before something that none of their scientific language was equipped to describe. Something that Dr. Voronov had already sensed when he wrote that they would raise questions about some things we believed we already understood. What they saw, if they saw anything at all, that went with them into the silence. And silence, unlike ice, does not melt.